Somewhere on the top floor of a luxury hotel, behind blackout curtains that haven't been opened in years, a man lies on a recliner in total darkness. He is 6 feet 1 inch tall, but he weighs only 90 pounds. His hair hangs past his shoulders, tangled and unwashed. His fingernails have curled inward because he won't let anyone cut them. His arms are scarred and dotted with marks from thousands of injections. Some of the needles broke off under his skin and were never removed. They're still in there, buried in the tissue. He is surrounded by stacks of old newspapers, jars of urine, and used tissues arranged in patterns only he understands. He hasn't left this room in months. He hasn't seen sunlight in years. This man was once the most famous aviator on the planet. He broke world speed records. He flew around the globe in 91 hours. He produced Hollywood blockbusters, dated the most beautiful actresses alive, and built a business empire worth billions. He was Howard Hughes. And by the time he reached his final years, the richest man in America couldn't walk to his own bathroom. How does this happen? How does a man who had everything slowly lose himself? The answer isn't one bad decision or one terrible day. It's a sequence, a chain of losses, fears, injuries, and obsessions, each one closing another door between Howard Hughes and the rest of the world, one door at a time, year after year, until there were no doors left to open. So this is the story of how Howard Hughes disappeared, not from the world, from himself. To understand how Howard Hughes ended up alone in a dark room, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a house in Houston, Texas, where a little boy was learning something that would shape the rest of his life. He was learning to be afraid. Howard Robard Hughes Jr. was born on December 24, 1905, in Humble, Texas. His father, Howard Hughes Sr., was a wildcat oilman turned inventor who had created the Hughes rock bit, a revolutionary drill bit that could cut through the hardest underground rock formations. The invention changed the oil industry overnight. Companies that had been stuck for years, unable to drill through certain geological layers, suddenly could. Hughes Sr. didn't just sell the drill bit, he leased it. Every oil company in Texas and beyond had to pay him to use his technology. The money poured in. By the time young Howard was a child, his family was among the wealthiest in Texas. His mother, Aline Gano Hughes, came from a prominent Dallas family. She was refined, protective, and deeply anxious about one thing above all else: disease. This was early 20th century America. Polio was sweeping through communities without warning. Tuberculosis, influenza, and a dozen other illnesses could kill a child before doctors even understood what was wrong. Alain had reason to be concerned. Every parent did. But Aline's concern went beyond what most parents felt. She checked young Howard's body every single day, looking for signs of illness. She inspected his teeth. She monitored his bowel movements. When outbreaks of polio or other diseases were reported anywhere nearby, she pulled Howard out of school and kept him isolated from other children. She controlled what he touched, who he played with, where he went. She created invisible walls around her son made entirely of fear. This wasn't cruelty. Aline loved Howard deeply. She was trying to protect him in the only way she knew how. But love filtered through fear teaches a child something very specific. It teaches him that the world is dangerous, that contamination is everywhere, that safety only comes from constant watchfulness, constant control, constant separation from the things that might harm you. Howard absorbed this lesson completely. It settled into his bones the way his father's ambition settled into his brain. Both would define him. Both would eventually destroy him. And then the people who had given him those lessons disappeared. In 1922, when Howard was 16 years old, Aline Hughes went into surgery for an ectopic pregnancy. The procedure was considered routine. It wasn't. Aline died on the operating table. She was 39 years old. The woman who had spent her entire life trying to protect her son from death was taken by it without warning. Howard was devastated. His mother had been the emotional center of his world. She was the one who worried, who watched, who cared enough to check every day whether he was safe. Now she was gone, and Howard was left with her fear, but without her presence. The lessons remained. The comfort didn't. Then, almost exactly 2 years later, on January 14th, 1924, Howard Hughes Sr. suffered a massive heart attack at his office. He was 54 years old. He died almost instantly. The man who had built an empire from nothing, who had invented a tool that changed an entire industry, who had shown his son that the world could be conquered through brilliance and force of will, was gone. Howard Hughes Jr. was 18 years old, both parents dead, no siblings, an orphan with a fortune and no one to share it with. He inherited 75% of Hughes Tool Company. The business was generating enormous revenue from drill bit leases across the American oil industry. Howard was rich beyond what most people could imagine, but he was also completely alone. And instead of stopping to grieve, instead of processing what he had lost, he did something that would become his pattern for the rest of his life. He took control. He convinced a Texas court to declare him a legal adult so he could manage the company himself. He didn't want guardians. He didn't want trustees. He didn't want anyone standing between him and the thing his father had built. He would run it himself. He would make his own decisions. He would need no one. At 18, Howard Hughes owned $1 million company and had no one to go home to. He pointed himself toward Hollywood, toward the sky, toward anything that moved fast enough to outrun what he was feeling. Howard Hughes arrived in Los Angeles in 1926. He was 20 years old, impossibly rich, and completely unknown. Hollywood didn't care about Texas oil money. Hollywood cared about talent, connections, and the ability to survive in a world that chewed people up and spit them out before breakfast. Hughes had none of those things. What he had was money, nerve, and an absolute refusal to be told no. He started producing films. His early efforts were forgettable. Small pictures that came and went without making much noise. But Hughes wasn't interested in small. He wanted to make the biggest, a most spectacular film Hollywood had ever seen. He wanted to make something that would force the world to know his name. The result was Hell's Angels. Released in 1930, Hell's Angels was a World War I aviation epic that nearly killed Hughes before it made him famous. He spent $3.8 million on the production, roughly $70 million in today's money, making it the most expensive film ever produced at that time. He hired 87 pilots to fly real combat sequences in real planes, and he insisted on authenticity. No tricks, no miniatures, real aircraft doing real stunts in real skies. 3 pilots died during filming. Hughes himself climbed into a cockpit for one sequence when he decided his stunt pilot wasn't flying aggressively enough. He crashed the plane, fractured his skull, and walked away. He went back to the set the next day. The film was a massive hit. Critics praised the aerial sequences as the most thrilling footage ever captured on camera. And suddenly, the quiet kid from Texas was one of the most talked about men in Hollywood. He wasn't just rich anymore. He was famous. And fame opened doors that money alone couldn't. Over the next several years, Hughes dated some of the most celebrated women in America. Katharine Hepburn, Ava Gardner, Ginger Rogers, Olivia de Havilland, Bette Davis. He moved through Hollywood like someone who believed the rules didn't apply to him. And for a while they didn't. But Hollywood was only half the story. The other half was in the sky. Hughes had been fascinated with aviation since childhood. Flying gave him something that nothing else could. Control. In a cockpit, the only person responsible for what happened was the pilot. There were no employees to manage, no press to handle, no complicated relationships to navigate. Just the machine, the sky, and his own skill. In 1935, he set the airspeed record, flying the H-1 Racer at 352 miles per hour over Santa Ana, California. He designed much of the aircraft himself, obsessing over every detail of its construction. When the engine cut out during the record attempt, and he was forced to crash land in a beet field, he climbed out of the wreckage and asked when he could go again. Then, in 1938, he did something even more extraordinary. He flew around the entire world in 91 hours, cutting the previous record nearly in half. When he landed back in New York, 1 million people lined the streets for a ticker tape parade. He received the Congressional Gold Medal. He was on the cover of every major magazine in America. He was 32 years old. Howard Hughes stood on top of the world, literally. He had conquered Hollywood. He had conquered the sky. He had money, fame, women, and the admiration of an entire country. He had proven that the orphaned boy from Houston could become anything he wanted. But there was something else happening during these years that almost nobody noticed. People who spent time with Hughes in private saw things, small things. He washed his hands more than seemed normal. He had specific requirements about how objects were handed to him. He didn't like being touched unexpectedly. He had rituals around food that went beyond preference into something more rigid, more anxious. If a glass was placed in front of him and someone else had touched the rim, he wouldn't drink from it. If a fork wasn't positioned exactly right, he would ask for a new one. As in the 1930s, these behaviors were manageable. People called them quirks, eccentricities, the habits of a genius who thought differently from everyone else. Nobody used the word disorder. Nobody suggested he needed help. He was Howard Hughes. He could afford to be particular. But the rituals were growing. Slowly, quietly, underneath the records and the headlines and the movie premieres, something was building inside Howard Hughes that would eventually consume him. He just didn't know it yet. In 1938, Howard Hughes stood on top of the world. He was rich, famous, fearless, and free. He had conquered Hollywood, conquered the sky, and convinced himself that if he kept moving fast enough, nothing could touch him. Then, on a July afternoon in 1946, the world touched back. On the afternoon of July 7th, 1946, Howard Hughes climbed into the cockpit of the XF-11, an experimental military reconnaissance aircraft that his company had built for the United States Army Air Forces. The plane was designed for high-altitude spy missions. It was fast, powerful, and completely untested in real flight conditions. Hughes was going to test it himself. This was how he operated. He didn't hand things off. He didn't trust other people to do what he could do himself. If there was risk involved, he wanted to be the one taking it. Control. Always control. The flight started well. Hughes took the XF-11 up over Los Angeles, so pushing the aircraft through a series of maneuvers designed to test its limits. For the first hour, everything worked the way it was supposed to. The plane handled beautifully. Hughes was confident. He radioed back positive reports. Then something went wrong. An oil leak caused the rear propeller on the right side to reverse its pitch. Instead of pulling the plane forward, it was now working against the other engine, dragging the aircraft sideways. The XF-11 began losing altitude. Hughes fought the controls, trying to compensate, trying to keep the plane level, but the physics were against him. The plane was coming down whether he wanted it to or not. He scanned the ground below for somewhere to land. He spotted the Los Angeles Country Club golf course and aimed for it. If he could reach the fairway, he might survive. He almost made it. The XF-11 clipped the roof of a house on Whittier Drive in Beverly Hills. Then it tore through a second house. Then it hit a third structure, a garage, and exploded into flames. The wreckage scattered across the residential street. Aviation fuel ignited. The cockpit was engulfed in fire with Hughes still inside. A Marine sergeant named William Lloyd Durkin was nearby when the crash happened. He heard the impact, ran toward the burning wreckage, and found Hughes trapped in the cockpit, surrounded by fire. Durkin pulled him out. If he had arrived even a minute later, then Howard Hughes would have burned to death on a quiet street in Beverly Hills. Hughes was rushed to the hospital. The list of injuries was staggering. His left lung had collapsed. The impact had shifted his heart from the left side of his chest cavity to the right. 12 ribs were broken. His collarbone was fractured. His skull was cracked in multiple places. Third-degree burns covered large portions of his chest, his face, and both hands. Internal bleeding was severe. Doctors told his associates to prepare for the worst. They weren't sure he would survive the night. But Howard Hughes survived. He had always survived. The skull fracture from Hell's Angels. The crash landing in the beet field. Now this. His body had an almost stubborn refusal to quit, even when every medical indicator suggested it should. The recovery took months. He lay in a hospital bed, wrapped in bandages, unable to move without excruciating pain. Every breath hurt because of the broken ribs. Every slight movement sent waves of agony through his shattered body. And to manage that pain, doctors did what doctors did in 1946. They gave him morphine. They gave him codeine. They gave him whatever it took to keep the pain at a level where he could function, where he could breathe, where he could sleep. It worked. The drugs dulled the agony. They allowed his body to heal. Bones knit back together. Burns scarred over. The collapsed lung reinflated. Slowly, over weeks and months, Howard Hughes put himself back together physically. But the drugs didn't stop. When the medical need for painkillers ended, the psychological need continued. Hughes had spent months in a state where codeine was the only thing standing between him and unbearable suffering. His brain had learned the equation. Pain equals drugs. Anxiety equals drugs. Fear equals drugs. The addiction took root quietly, the way a crack spreads through a foundation. You don't notice it at first. By the time you do, the structure is already compromised. For the next 30 years, until the very last day of his life, Howard Hughes was never fully free of opiates. The codeine that saved him from pain after the crash became the chain that held him for the rest of his existence. He didn't choose addiction, it was prescribed to him, but it became his constant companion, working alongside the OCD that had been building since childhood, forming a partnership that would slowly dismantle everything he had built. The crash didn't just break his body, it gave his oldest fear a new ally, and together, the obsessive need for control and the chemical need for relief would do what no business failure, no romantic rejection, no public scandal ever could. They would take Howard Hughes apart, piece by piece, behind closed doors where nobody could see. The man who walked out of that hospital was different from the man who had climbed into that cockpit. Something fundamental had shifted. The fearlessness was gone. In its place was something he had learned from his mother decades earlier and had spent his entire adult life trying to outrun. Fear. And this time, he couldn't outrun it, because this time, it was coming from inside. After the crash, Howard Hughes went back to work. That was what he did. That was what he had always done. Lose something, take control of something else. Feel pain, move faster. The pattern his father had modeled and his mother's death had cemented was still running underneath everything. Don't stop. Don't sit with it. Don't feel it. Just keep building. And build he did. Hughes bought Transworld Airlines in the late 1940s and transformed it from a small domestic carrier into a major international airline. TWA became one of the most recognized names in aviation, flying routes across the Atlantic and competing with Pan Am for dominance of the skies. Hughes controlled every detail of the airline's operations, from the routes it flew to the design of its terminals. He treated TWA the way he treated everything, as something that belonged to him completely. At the same time, Hughes Aircraft Company was growing into one of the most important defense contractors in the United States. The company built radar systems, satellites, weapons systems, and electronic equipment for the military. During the Cold War, when the American government was spending billions on defense technology, Hughes aircraft was right at the center of it. The contracts were enormous. The profits were staggering. And then there was the Spruce Goose. Officially called the H-4 Hercules, it was the largest flying boat ever built. Hughes had designed it during World War II as a way to transport troops and materials across the Atlantic without risking German submarine attacks. The government funded the project, but by the time the war ended, the plane still wasn't finished. Congress accused Hughes of wasting taxpayer money. They hauled him before a Senate committee and questioned him publicly, suggesting he was a fraud who had taken government contracts and delivered nothing. Hughes was furious. On November 2nd, 1947, he took the Spruce Goose out onto Long Beach Harbor and flew it, only for about a mile, only 70 feet above the water, but he flew it. He proved it could work. He proved he wasn't a fraud. Then he put the plane in a climate-controlled hangar and never flew it again. He spent roughly $1 million per year maintaining it for the rest of his life. It wasn't about the plane anymore. It was about control, about proving that no one could tell him what was real and what wasn't. On the surface, Hughes looked like a titan in these years. Airlines, defense contracts, government battles, billion-dollar companies. He was one of the most powerful men in America. But behind the closed doors of his private life, something was changing. Slowly, quietly, in ways that only the people closest to him could see. The OCD was getting worse. It had always been there. The hand-washing, the discomfort with being touched, the rituals around food and objects. But after the crash, after the months of hospitalization, after the addiction took hold, the behaviors began to escalate. What had once been quirks were becoming rules, and the rules were becoming laws. Hughes began writing memos to his staff, not ordinary business memos, detailed, obsessive instructions about hygiene and procedure. One memo that would later become infamous described exactly how to open a can of peaches. It specified which hand to use when picking up the can, how many times to wash the can before opening it, how to grip the can opener, how to remove the lid without letting anything touch the inside surface, how to pour the fruit, how to hold the spoon. The instructions ran to multiple pages. For a can of peaches, he created what he called insulation procedures. These were elaborate rules for how objects could be passed to him. Nothing could touch his hands directly. Everything had to be wrapped in tissue paper or held with multiple layers of cloth. If an aide handed him a document, the aide had to hold it with tissues on both sides so that no fingerprints contaminated the paper. If someone gave him a spoon, it had to be wrapped in a specific way, with a specific number of tissue layers, gripped at a specific point. He stopped shaking hands. Then he stopped touching doorknobs. Then he stopped touching anything that another person had touched. Each new rule was logical in his mind. Each one was a defense against contamination, against the invisible threats his mother had warned him about decades ago. But each rule was also a door closing. Each restriction cut off one more point of contact between Howard Hughes and the rest of the world. And then there was Jean Peters. In 1957, Hughes married actress Jean Peters in a small ceremony in Tonopah, Nevada. Peters was different from the Hollywood stars Hughes had dated in his younger years. She wasn't interested in fame or glamour. She was grounded, intelligent, and genuinely cared about Hughes as a person. She saw past the money and the reputation. She wanted a real marriage with a real partner. What she got was something she could never have prepared for. Hughes and Peters lived in the same building, but they occupied separate rooms, sometimes separate floors. Communication between husband and wife happened through handwritten notes passed back and forth by Hughes's aides. Peters would write a message, hand it to an aide, and the aide would deliver it to Hughes. Hughes would respond the same way. Two people married to each other, living steps apart, passing notes like strangers. There were stretches where Jean Peters did not see her own husband for months, not because he was traveling, Not because he was busy. He was right there, in the next room or the floor above, but he wouldn't open the door. He couldn't. The contamination fears, the rituals, the need for total control over his environment had made physical closeness impossible, even with the woman he had chosen to marry. Peters later described the marriage as profoundly lonely. She had married a man, but over the years the man retreated behind layers of ritual and fear and locked doors until there was nothing left to hold on to. They divorced in 1971 after 14 years. Jean Peters had married Howard Hughes. By the time she left, she was married to a locked door. By the early 1960s, Howard Hughes had closed most of the doors between himself and the world. He had stopped appearing in public. He had stopped meeting people face to face. He had stopped touching things, stopped eating meals with others, stopped doing almost everything that connected him to normal human life. But he hadn't reached the bottom yet. The bottom was waiting for him in Las Vegas. On Thanksgiving Day, 1966, Howard Hughes arrived at the Desert Inn Hotel in Las Vegas. He was 61 years old, and he checked into the top 2 floors of the building, bringing with him a small group of personal aides. The curtains were drawn immediately. The windows were sealed. No sunlight would enter those rooms for as long as Hughes occupied them. He had come to Las Vegas for what was supposed to be a temporary stay. A few weeks, maybe a month. He never intended to live there. But days became weeks, weeks became months, and Howard Hughes never left. Whilst the aides who surrounded him were almost exclusively Mormon men, Hughes had chosen them deliberately. Mormons didn't drink alcohol. They didn't smoke. They followed strict codes of personal cleanliness. For a man terrified of contamination, these qualities made them ideal companions. The group became known as the Mormon Mafia, and their leader was a man named Bill Gay. These aides became Hughes's only connection to the outside world. They brought him food. They delivered his messages. They managed his medications. They controlled who could contact him and what information reached him. Slowly, without anyone fully realizing it, the people Hughes had hired to serve him began to control him instead. After several months, the Desert Inn management wanted their penthouse back. The top floors were supposed to be reserved for high-rolling gamblers who spent money in the casino. Hughes just sat up there in the dark, not gambling, not socializing, not generating any revenue. As the hotel asked him to leave, Hughes's solution was simple. He bought the hotel. The price was $13.2 million. He made the deal without ever leaving his room, without ever meeting the sellers face to face, without ever stepping into the casino he now owned. Then he kept buying. The sands, the frontier, the castaways, the landmark. One by one, Hughes acquired the most famous casinos in Las Vegas. And he bought the Silver Slipper specifically because its rotating neon sign shone through his blacked-out windows. When he couldn't get the sign turned off, he simply purchased the entire property. He spent roughly $300 million on Las Vegas real estate, all from his bed, all through his aides, all without seeing sunlight or breathing fresh air. Inside the penthouse, life followed patterns that would seem insane to anyone on the outside. Hughes lay on a recliner, not a bed. As surrounded by stacks of old newspapers he refused to throw away. He watched movies on a loop, sometimes the same film dozens of times in a row. His diet was bizarre and rigidly controlled. Chicken, chocolate bars, milk, sometimes nothing but dessert for weeks at a time. He urinated into jars rather than walk to the bathroom. He stored used tissues in patterns around his chair, arranged according to rules only he understood. The room smelled terrible. The hygiene that his mother had obsessed over, that he himself had obsessed over for decades, had somehow inverted. The man terrified of contamination was living in filth of his own creation. The codeine injections continued daily, multiple times per day, administered not by doctors, but by his aides. Men with no medical training who pushed needles into arms that were already scarred and damaged from thousands of previous injections. Sometimes the needles broke off under the skin. Nobody removed them. They stayed there, buried in his flesh, while new injections went into new spots. Hughes's business empire still functioned. Decisions were still made. Contracts were still signed. But increasingly, those decisions were made by the aides, by Bill Gay and the other members of the Mormon Mafia. They controlled access to Hughes so completely that executives in his own companies couldn't reach him. Lawyers trying to get documents signed had to go through layers of intermediaries. Or some began to wonder whether Hughes was even making decisions anymore, or whether the aides were making them and simply claiming Hughes's authority. The richest man in America had become a prisoner, not of the government, not of enemies, of the people he paid to protect him. Every check on the aide's power had been removed. Hughes had no family members checking in on him, no friends who could demand to see him, no wife knocking on the door, just the aides, the needles, the darkness, and the endless loop of movies playing on a screen in a room that smelled like decay. Howard Hughes had locked the world out, but in doing so, he had locked himself in with the very people who had the most to gain from keeping him exactly where he was. Nobody outside the inner circle knew where he had gone. One day he was in Las Vegas. The next day he had vanished. The most famous recluse in America had become a ghost, and the ghost was about to start wandering. Over the next 6 years, Hughes moved from country to country, hotel to hotel, always on a stretcher, always in secret, always in the middle of the night. The Bahamas, then Nicaragua, then Vancouver, Canada, then London, then back to the Bahamas, then Acapulco, Mexico. Each location was different on a map. In every other way, they were identical. Top floor of a luxury hotel, blackout curtains sealing every window, the same recliner, the same aides, the same darkness, the same needles, the same jars of urine and stacks of newspapers and tissues arranged in patterns around his chair. Hughes was circling the globe, but he never saw any of it. The geography changed. The prison stayed exactly the same, as his physical condition was collapsing. The body that had once been tall and handsome, the body that had survived plane crashes and set aviation records, was wasting away. His weight dropped steadily, from 150 pounds to 130 to 110, eventually to under 100. His 6'1" frame looked skeletal. His skin hung loose on bones that had nothing left to support them. His hair grew past his shoulders, tangled and matted. His beard became a wild, filthy mess. His fingernails curled inward because he refused to let anyone cut them. Bed sores developed from lying in the same position for days without moving. His teeth were rotting from neglect and the constant sugar of his bizarre diet. The needle marks on his arms had become a map of damage. Thousands of injections over thousands of days had scarred the tissue completely. Sometimes the needles broke off inside him, snapped by aides who had no medical training and no idea how to properly administer drugs. The broken pieces stayed embedded in his flesh. New injections went into whatever spots hadn't been completely destroyed. He was suffering from severe malnutrition. His kidneys were failing. Dental infections had spread through his jaw. He was in constant pain, which meant constant codeine, which meant further deterioration. The cycle had no exit. And during all of this, while Hughes rotted in darkness, as his name was still being used by people with their own agendas, the CIA used Hughes' company as a cover for Project Azorian, a top-secret mission to raise a sunken Soviet submarine from the Pacific Ocean floor. The cover story told the world that Hughes was building a deep-sea mining ship called the Glomar Explorer. The truth was Cold War espionage at 16,000 feet underwater. Whether Hughes fully understood what was happening remains unclear. By this point, his aides controlled what information reached him. The most powerful man in America had become a brand name that other powerful people borrowed when they needed a convincing lie. By April 1976, Howard Hughes was dying. Everyone around him knew it. The question was no longer whether he would survive, but whether anyone would try to save him, or whether the people closest to him had too much to lose by letting a doctor through the door. In early April 1976, and Howard Hughes was at the Acapulco Princess Hotel in Mexico. He was barely conscious. His body had deteriorated beyond anything his aides had seen before. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sit up. He drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes not recognizing where he was or who was in the room with him. His personal physician, a doctor who hadn't actually examined Hughes in person for years, was finally contacted. The aides described the situation. The doctor told them what they already knew. Hughes needed to be in a hospital, immediately. If he didn't receive proper medical care soon, he would die. The decision was made to fly Hughes to Houston. Methodist Hospital had doctors who might be able to help. More importantly, Houston was where Hughes had grown up. If he was going to die, perhaps he should die in the city where his life had started. On the morning of April 5, 1976, Hughes was carried onto a private jet on a stretcher. He weighed approximately 90 pounds. When his body was shutting down, kidney failure had progressed to a critical stage. Dehydration had made his condition even worse. The malnutrition that had been building for years had left him with almost nothing to fight with. The plane took off from Acapulco and headed north toward Texas. Somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, Hughes's condition worsened. His breathing became shallow. His vital signs dropped. The aides on the plane could do nothing but watch. They had no medical training. They had no equipment. They had spent years giving him injections and controlling his environment, but they had no ability to save his life when it actually mattered. At approximately 1:27 p.m., while the plane was still in the air over Texas, Howard Hughes died. He was 70 years old. The man who had set aviation records, who had flown around the world faster than anyone in history, who had built aircraft that changed the course of military technology, died on an airplane. He never reached the hospital. He never saw a doctor. He died in the sky, the one place where he had always felt most free, most in control, most alive. There is something almost poetic about that, if poetry can be that cruel. When the plane landed in Houston, Hughes' body was taken to Methodist Hospital, but the doctors there faced an unexpected problem. They couldn't identify him. The man on the stretcher weighed 90 pounds. His hair hung past his shoulders in filthy tangles. His fingernails had curled into spirals. His arms were scarred and pockmarked from decades of injections, with broken needle fragments still embedded under the skin. His face was gaunt, hollow, unrecognizable. This was supposed to be Howard Hughes, the aviator, the movie producer, the billionaire, the man who had once been called the most handsome man in Hollywood. The FBI was called. They took his fingerprints and compared them against records on file. The prints matched. The skeletal figure on the hospital table was confirmed to be Howard Robard Hughes, Jr. The richest man in America died with broken needles in his arms, weighing less than most teenagers, identified by fingerprints because no one could recognize his face. He left behind a $2.5 billion fortune and not a single valid will. Howard Hughes had spent decades controlling every detail of his life, every document that entered his room, every spoon that touched his food, every person who came near him. But the one thing that mattered most after his death, he had never controlled at all. He left no valid will. A man worth $2.5 billion, a man who owned airlines and casinos and defense companies and hotels, had never put his wishes on paper in any legally binding way. The result was one of the most complicated estate battles in American legal history. Distant relatives came forward. Former business associates filed claims. The states of Texas and California both argued they were owed inheritance taxes. Lawyers multiplied like bacteria in a wound. The legal proceedings would drag on for decades, generating fees that ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Hughes had spent his final years terrified of contamination. In death, his fortune was contaminated by everyone who could find a reason to grab a piece. And then there was Melvin Dummar. Dummar was a gas station attendant from Utah. Shortly after Hughes's death, a handwritten will surfaced at the headquarters of the Mormon Church in Salt Lake City. The will left 1/16 of Hughes's estate, approximately $156 million, to Melvin Dummar. Dummar told a strange story. He claimed that years earlier, in December 1967, he had been driving through the Nevada desert at night when he spotted a man lying on the ground near the highway. The man was thin, disheveled, barefoot, and disoriented. Dummar picked him up and drove him to Las Vegas. During the ride, the man said he was Howard Hughes. Dummar claimed he hadn't believed the stranger at the time. Who would? A barefoot man wandering alone in the desert, claiming to be the richest man in America. It sounded like madness. But after Hughes died and the will appeared, Dummar said it all made sense. Hughes had remembered his kindness and left him a fortune. Courts didn't buy it. As handwriting experts analyzed the will and concluded it was a forgery, the document was thrown out. Dummar received nothing, but he maintained his story for the rest of his life, insisting until his death in 2018 that he really had picked up Howard Hughes on that desert highway. Whether he was telling the truth, whether he was lying, or whether he had convinced himself of something that never happened, remains one of the strangest footnotes in the Hughes story. What did survive Hughes was something he had created almost as an afterthought. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute, established in 1953 originally as a tax shelter, grew into one of the largest private research organizations in the world. Today, it has an endowment of roughly $23 billion. It funds scientific research into disease, genetics, and human biology. The germaphobe's fortune now fights the very thing he feared most: contamination, illness, the invisible threats his mother had warned him about when he was just a boy. There is an irony in that so heavy, it almost feels like justice. Picture the penthouse again, the blackout curtains, the darkness, the skeletal figure on the recliner, surrounded by newspapers and tissues and jars, the matted hair, the curled fingernails, the broken needles buried under scarred skin. Now you understand how he got there. A mother who taught him the world was contaminated, and a father who showed him that control was everything. Both dead before he turned 19, a plane crash that shattered his body and gave him an addiction that never let go. A mind that built walls out of rituals, each one logical on its own, each one another door closing between Howard Hughes and everyone who might have helped him. He didn't go mad all at once, nobody does. He went door by door. Each step made sense at the time. Each rule was protection against something real or something that felt real. Wash your hands, avoid contamination, control what touches you, control who sees you, control everything. Because the moment you stop controlling, something terrible happens. Something like your mother dying. Something like your father's heart stopping. Something like a plane falling out of the sky. The man who flew around the world in 91 hours spent his final decade unable to walk to his own bathroom. The man who dated Katharine Hepburn and Ava Gardner couldn't let his own wife into his room. The man who built an empire worth billions was identified by fingerprints because nobody could recognize his face. That's the part of this story no one wants to say out loud. It could happen to anyone. Not the billions, not the fame, but the slow retreat. The closing of one door, then another, until you look around and realize there's no way back out. Your fear doesn't need to be rational to be powerful. Loss doesn't need to make sense to leave scars. And control, the thing we reach for when everything else fails, can become the very cage that traps us. The last door closed at 1:27 p.m. over Texas, and the boy who lost his mother, who lost his father, who spent his entire life trying to lock out the world, finally succeeded.